What if I told you that the man who built one of the most recognizable television empires in American history was told at 17 years old that he would amount to nothing? What if I told you that this same man buried his father, buried his son, watched his marriages fall apart one by one, fought a brain condition that hijacked his body without warning since the age of 8, and still, after all of that, after every single thing the world threw at him, he walked back behind that same counter, looked straight into the camera, and kept going. And now, in March of 2026, the story has taken turns so dramatic, so raw, so deeply human, that even his most devoted fans are only now beginning to understand what this man has actually survived. I am talking about Rick Harrison, the Pawn Star, the negotiator, the high school dropout who turned a struggling shop on a rough stretch of Las Vegas Boulevard into a global phenomenon. And today we are going to tell you every single thing the cameras never showed you. Because the thing about Rick Harrison is that most people think they know him. They watched him on television for 15 years. They saw him pick up Roman coins and Civil War rifles and pieces of Americana, and speak about them with a kind of calm, certain authority that made you feel like you were watching a man who had figured something out that the rest of the world had not. They saw the family dynamics, the jokes, the deals, the experts who walked through the door, the customers who arrived carrying desperation along with whatever object they hoped would rescue them. They saw the show, but they did not see the story underneath the show. And that story is the one worth telling. Because it is not a story about fame or money or television ratings. It is a story about what it actually costs to build something extraordinary, about the price that does not show up on any balance sheet, about the losses that no fortune can bargain away, and about a man who is still, right now, in 2026, standing inside the consequences of every choice and every loss his life has accumulated. Let us start at the very beginning, because Rick Harrison's story cannot be understood without understanding where it began. He was born on March 22, 1965, in Lexington, North Carolina. His father, Richard Harrison Sr., was a career Navy officer. Disciplined, stoic, a man who believed in endurance, not escape, who believed that hardship was something you absorbed and used, not something you ran from. Because of his father's military postings, Rick's childhood was a relentless series of uprooting. New cities, new schools, new faces that never had enough time to become actual friends before the next move arrived. For most children, school is the one constant, the one place where identity begins to form. For Rick, even that was taken away over and over. Just as he began to find his footing somewhere, just as a classroom started to feel less foreign and a neighborhood started to feel less temporary, the family packed up and moved again, and whatever fragile sense of belonging he had started to build was left behind, like furniture too heavy to carry. But the transient life was not the deepest wound Rick carried into childhood. That wound had a name, and the name was epilepsy. At 8 years old, Rick Harrison had his first seizure. The world went dark without warning. His body betrayed him in the most terrifying and public of ways. In an instant, the boy who already struggled to fit in because he was always the new kid, always the outsider, always the one who had not been there long enough to matter, became the boy others stared at, whispered about, and quietly avoided. Epilepsy in the late 1970s was not spoken about with the understanding or the compassion it commands today. It was feared. It was misunderstood. And for a child already moving from school to school with no roots and no anchor, it became one more reason to feel fundamentally, irreversibly different from everyone around him. The seizures disrupted everything. Reading became a battlefield. Concentration fractured. Classroom environments that were already foreign became almost hostile. Teachers did not always know how to help. Peers did not always know how to respond. And Rick, proud and quietly fierce even then, refused to ask for either. What he did instead would define the rest of his life. He read, not textbooks assigned by schools that barely knew his name. He read everything else. History, philosophy, economics, military strategy, biographies of men and women who had built things from nothing. While his classmates memorized what they were told to memorize, Rick Harrison was quietly constructing an education entirely his own, page by page, book by book, in whatever corner of whatever temporary home the family occupied at the time. It was not the education a system would ever recognize or certify, but it was, in every way that actually mattered, the education that would eventually make him extraordinary. The boy bedridden by seizures who devoured books about the Great Brain and the Royal Navy was already becoming, without anyone noticing, the man who would one day hold a 200-year-old artifact across a glass counter and know things about it that would stop a room full of people cold. By his teenage years, the Harrison family had settled in Las Vegas, Nevada, a city that runs entirely on illusion, on the promise that ordinary people can become extraordinary overnight. Rick saw through that promise almost immediately. He was not built for gambling. He was built for something harder, for negotiation, for reading people, for understanding value where others saw only surface. But the school system had already rendered its verdict on Rick Harrison, and the verdict was not kind. A teenager with epilepsy, a fractured academic record, and a restlessness that no classroom could contain. He dropped out of high school at 17. To the world looking in, it looked like failure. To Rick, it was simply the moment he stopped pretending that the path being offered was ever meant for him. His father did not rage. He offered something else. Come work. Learn by doing. Learn by losing. Learn by surviving. And so Rick did. In 1989, Richard Harrison Sr. opened the gold and silver pawn shop on Las Vegas Boulevard. It was not a glamorous beginning. Not by any measure. The neighborhood was rough. The hours were brutal. The clientele arrived carrying desperation more often than treasure. People walked through those doors because they had nowhere else to go. Because the rent was due, or the lights had been cut off, or because something had gone badly wrong in a life that had already seen too many things go badly wrong. Rick stood behind that counter and watched. Listened. Learned. Every object that crossed the glass had a story beneath its price. Every customer was a negotiation waiting to happen. And in that gritty, unglamorous pawn shop on the edge of Las Vegas, the boy who had been told by circumstance that he did not belong anywhere began slowly and deliberately to build the one place where he absolutely did. The cameras were still years away. The fame was unimaginable. But the foundation was already being laid, and it was not being laid with privilege or connections or any of the advantages that the world typically assigns to people who eventually succeed. It was being laid with the one currency Rick Harrison had always possessed in surplus, the stubborn, relentless, bone-deep refusal to quit. The early years behind that counter were a relentless education in failure. Rick was 18 years old when he first began to truly understand what it meant to run a business on the margins. Not from textbooks, not from lectures, but from the grinding, unglamorous reality of watching the month's numbers fall short again and again, watching desperate customers walk in with objects worth far less than their hope, and watching his father's face carry the quiet strain of a man who had bet his family's stability on an idea that the world had not yet agreed to believe in. Las Vegas in the late 1980s and early 1990s was a city of extremes. Obscene wealth on one side of the street, quiet devastation on the other. The gold and silver pawn shop existed firmly in the middle, serving the people the casinos had already emptied. Rick learned early that pawn was not a glamorous trade. It was a trade built on other people's misfortune, and navigating that reality with both honesty and business sense required a particular kind of emotional intelligence that no school could have taught him. But the business was only one battlefield. His personal life was opening its own front. Rick married young. His first marriage to Kim Harrison came with the kind of optimism that only youth can sustain. Together they had 2 sons, Corey and Adam. But the weight of a struggling business, the relentless hours, the financial uncertainty that clung to every month like smoke, began to erode what love alone could not hold together. The marriage collapsed. Rick Harrison, still only in his 20s, found himself simultaneously trying to save a business and rebuild the wreckage of a family structure he had wanted desperately to get right. He had not forgotten what it felt like to grow up without roots. He did not want his sons to inherit that particular wound. The guilt of a failed marriage layered itself over the stress of financial survival. There were months when the pawn shop teetered on the edge. Months when the bills stacked against the glass cases that held other people's valuables, and Rick stood behind them wondering if the whole thing was about to come apart. Yet what kept him standing was not confidence. It was calculation. Rick Harrison had spent years reading and studying and absorbing knowledge that formal education had never offered him. Now behind that counter, he began to apply it with ruthless precision. He studied the objects people brought in with the obsession of a scholar. Coins, watches, weapons, art, military memorabilia, historical artifacts. He taught himself to identify value that others could not see, to negotiate from a position of knowledge rather than intuition, and to build a reputation in a city built on fleeting reputations as someone who dealt straight. Word spread slowly, then faster. The gold and silver began to attract a different kind of customer. Not only the desperate, but the curious. Collectors, historians, people who had inherited objects they did not understand and trusted Rick to tell them the truth. That trust became the foundation on which everything else would eventually be built. He married again, this time to Tracy, with whom he would have his youngest son, Jake. The second marriage brought a period of greater stability, a renewed sense of what he was working toward. But the hours remained brutal. The pressure remained constant. And the distance between who Rick was at work and who his family needed him to be at home was a gap he never fully knew how to close. It is the cost that ambitious men rarely calculate in advance. The price paid not by the builder himself, but by the people who love the builder and learn slowly that they will always share him with something larger than themselves. By the mid-2000s, the gold and silver pawn shop had survived what it was never supposed to survive. It had outlasted bad years, bad markets, bad luck, and the private turbulence of a man who never stopped pushing even when pushing cost him something irreplaceable. And then the cameras arrived. Nobody in television saw it coming. In 2009, the History Channel was not known for making stars. It was known for documentaries about wars and ancient civilizations and the slow machinery of historical events. It was not the network anyone would have chosen to launch a cultural phenomenon. And yet when cameras first rolled inside the gold and silver pawn shop on Las Vegas Boulevard, something happened that network executives had not fully predicted and could not entirely explain. America could not look away. Pawn Stars debuted on July 19, 2009. Within weeks, it became the highest-rated series in the History Channel's existence. Not because of special effects or scripted drama. Not because of celebrities or manufactured conflict, but because of something far rarer and far more difficult to manufacture on television: authenticity. Rick Harrison was not performing. He was simply being the man he had spent 40 years becoming. The negotiator, the historian, the reader of people and objects and situations. The man who had stood behind that counter through bad years and good, through personal collapse and stubborn reconstruction, and had come out the other side knowing things that most people his age had never bothered to learn. Viewers sensed it immediately. When Rick picked up a Civil War rifle, or a Roman coin, or a piece of Americana that had traveled a century to reach his counter, the knowledge behind his eyes was not rehearsed. It was real. And the family dynamic, his father the old man, his son Corey, and the perpetually enthusiastic Chum-Li, was so genuinely and comfortably and almost chaotically real that it made every polished reality show surrounding it look hollow by comparison. By 2011, Pawn Stars was averaging over 7 million viewers per episode. The gold and silver became one of the most visited tourist destinations in Las Vegas, drawing crowds that lined up around the block for a chance to stand where they had watched Rick stand on their television screens. The shop that had once struggled to survive the month was now generating millions. The man who had dropped out of high school at 17 was being interviewed by publications that had once ignored him entirely. But Rick Harrison had been in enough rooms to know exactly what sudden fame cost and what it concealed. Behind the cameras, the schedule was merciless. Filming consumed the shop in ways that complicated the actual business of running it. Real transactions became tangled with production schedules. The line between the authentic world Rick had built and the televised version of it blurred in ways that occasionally unsettled him. He later admitted that there were moments when he walked through his own shop and felt like a guest in someone else's story. The fame also brought scrutiny of a particular kind. Critics wrote pieces questioning whether the deals were staged. Competitors dismissed the show as entertainment masquerading as expertise. And the internet, with its endless appetite for contradiction, picked apart every negotiation, every valuation, every casual remark made under lights that were now impossible to escape. Rick responded the way he had always responded to skepticism, with knowledge, with patience, and with the quiet confidence of a man who understood that those who talk the loudest about a subject are rarely the ones who understand it deepest. The show ran season after season. The numbers held. The phenomenon did not fade the way most television phenomena do. And in its success, Rick Harrison became something he had never quite anticipated. Not just a television personality, not just a successful businessman, but a symbol of a particular kind of American story. The dropout who outran the graduates. The man who found value where others found clutter. The son who turned his father's modest gamble into a global brand. His estimated net worth climbed and kept climbing. His face appeared on merchandise, on billboards, on the screens of people in countries where Las Vegas existed only as an idea. The gold and silver pawn shop became as recognizable a Las Vegas landmark as anything the casinos had built with their billions. Yet Rick Harrison, standing in the middle of all of it, remained unsettled in ways the cameras never quite captured. Because fame has a way of illuminating everything you have built while simultaneously casting the deepest shadow over everything you have lost. And Rick Harrison had losses that no camera would ever be permitted to fully follow. Fame has a way of arriving, just as the people who needed you most have already learned to live without you. By the time Pawn Stars turned Rick Harrison into a household name, his sons were no longer small children waiting by the door. They were young men who had grown up watching their father pour everything he had into a business that demanded everything he had. Corey Harrison had grown up inside the gold and silver the way other children grow up inside their father's shadows. Present, watching, absorbing. He appeared on Pawn Stars from its earliest episodes, a young man trying to establish his own authority inside a space that would always carry his father's name first. The dynamic between them on screen was warm, occasionally combative, and unmistakably real. But off camera, the relationship carried the particular tension that exists between fathers who built something from nothing and sons who inherited both the blessing and the burden of that something. Rick admitted in later interviews that he had not always been the father he intended to be. The hours the shop demanded, the years of financial uncertainty, the eventual avalanche of television production. Each of these had taken time that could not be reclaimed. He had been present in the building. He had not always been present in the room. It is the quiet distinction that ambitious men spend the second half of their lives reckoning with. His second marriage to Tracy had provided a period of structure and stability that the family genuinely needed. But even that marriage could not withstand the gravitational pull of a man whose identity was inseparable from his work. The relationship eventually ended, adding another chapter to a personal history that Rick spoke about rarely, and only with the measured honesty of someone who had made peace with his own imperfection. He married a third time, to Deanna Burdett in 2013. It was a moment of genuine happiness. But the pattern held. The shop, the show, the schedule, the relentless machinery of an empire that had taken decades to build and could not simply be paused because a man had finally found peace at home. That marriage ended in divorce in 2020. Then came a fourth marriage to Amanda Palmer in 2021, which also ended in 2023. And Rick Harrison, standing on the far side of 4 marriages, 3 sons, decades behind a counter, and more seasons of television than most networks dream of, was carrying something heavier than any of his previous chapters had prepared him for. Because there are things that fame cannot protect you from, and Rick Harrison was about to learn this not once, but twice in the span of just a few years, in ways that no negotiation and no expertise and no accumulated fortune could soften. The first loss arrived in June 2018. Richard Harrison Sr., the old man, died at the age of 77. To the millions who had watched Pawn Stars, he was the lovable, unhurried patriarch behind the counter. The man who shuffled through the shop with the quiet authority of someone who had earned the right to move at his own pace. The one whose dry humor and genuine warmth had become as much a part of the show's identity as the deals themselves. But to Rick, he was something far more essential than a television character. He was the man who had opened a pawn shop on a rough stretch of Las Vegas Boulevard and handed his dropout son a counter to stand behind when the world had already written that son off. He was the discipline and the stubbornness and the belief that hard work applied consistently and without complaint was the only philosophy a man truly needed. He was, in every way that mattered, the foundation on which Rick Harrison had built everything. When the old man died, Rick stepped away from cameras and public life without announcement or explanation. Those closest to him described a man hollowed by grief in ways that the usual armor of competence and composure could not conceal. He had spent decades negotiating across a counter from people carrying loss. Now the loss was entirely his own, and there was no expertise in the world that could assign it a value or tell him what it was worth. He returned, because he always returned. But those who knew him well noted that something had shifted permanently behind his eyes. A quietness that had not been there before. A patience that grief sometimes carves into people, whether they ask for it or not. Then came January 2024, and the loss that broke something deeper still. Adam Harrison, Rick's second son, died at the age of 39. The cause was an accidental fentanyl overdose. A crisis that has consumed American families across every income level, every zip code, every category of privilege and struggle that a country can produce. It does not discriminate. It does not negotiate. And it does not care how recognizable a family's name is. Rick had watched Adam struggle for years. Had tried in the way that fathers try when trying is not enough, to intervene, to help, to pull someone back from a current that moves faster than love alone can swim against. He put Adam in rehab multiple times. Every time, there was progress. And then the fall back. And then the desperate hope that this time would hold. And then the fall back again. In a later interview, Rick described the anguish of watching this cycle with brutal honesty. He said that when he lost Adam, he second-guessed everything. Every decision. Every conversation. Every moment he had not been there, and every moment he had been there, and it had not been enough. When Adam died, Rick Harrison made a public statement that was brief and devastated. He asked for privacy. And he received, for a time, the grace of people who understood that some grief belongs only to the people carrying it. But grief of that magnitude does not stay private forever. It surfaces in the pauses between sentences. In the way a man looks when someone mentions his children, and he has to recalculate in real time how many he is answering for. In the heaviness that settles over a room when a subject is approached too closely and the person inside it braces, almost imperceptibly, against the weight of what that subject contains. And then, barely a year after losing Adam, Rick Harrison faced another devastating blow. In November 2025, his mother, Joan Harrison, passed away at a Las Vegas hospital at the age of 85. In the span of just over a year and a half, Rick had buried his son and his mother. 2 losses, back to back, in a life that had already survived more than most people are ever asked to carry. His representative asked for privacy. And the public, watching from a distance, was left to imagine what it felt like to be standing inside that level of compounding grief while the world continued to turn and the cameras continued to roll and the gold and silver pawn shop continued to draw its lines around the block on Las Vegas Boulevard. But here is where the story takes a turn that no one fully anticipated, a turn that is both unexpected and deeply human, because Rick Harrison, at 60 years old, in the middle of all of this loss, found something he had not been looking for. He found love. Her name is Angie Polishkin. She is 42 years old, a nurse in Las Vegas, 18 years younger than Rick, and by all accounts exactly the kind of steady, grounded presence that a man carrying this much weight genuinely needed. They went public in June 2024, just months after Adam's death. They traveled through Europe together, sharing photos beneath the Eiffel Tower in Paris, touring the Tower of London, moving through the world with a kind of quiet joy that felt, to people watching, like a man slowly remembering what it felt like to be present somewhere other than behind a counter. On March 6, 2025, Rick proposed to Angie with a ring he chose himself, a 6.5-carat pear-shaped diamond sourced from his own pawn shop, because of course it was. And on January 3, 2026, just days before the season 24 premiere of Pawn Stars, Rick Harrison and Angie Polishkin were married at a little white wedding chapel in Las Vegas, officiated by an Elvis Presley impersonator, in what was, by every account, a moment of genuine, uncomplicated happiness. They celebrated afterward at Rick's own restaurant, Rollin' Smoke Barbecue and Tavern, just steps away from the shop where everything began. He told the world after the wedding, with the directness that has always been his signature, that he is the happiest he has ever been. That he and Angie will figure everything out along the way. That he does not believe in prenups because he does not believe marriages are meant to be built with exit strategies. It was, for a man who has lived through 4 marriages and more loss than most people accumulate in 3 lifetimes, an extraordinarily unguarded thing to say. And people loved him for it. Because it was unmistakably, undeniably, completely Rick. But January 2026 did not bring only joy. Because within the same few weeks that Rick was stepping into a new marriage, his son Corey was fighting a battle of his own. Earlier in 2025, Corey Harrison had been involved in a terrifying motorcycle accident in Tulum, Mexico. The crash left him with 11 fractured ribs, a concussion, and significant facial injuries. He spent extended time in the hospital. The bills were staggering, crossing 6 figures. And Corey, who had stepped back from the height of Pawn Stars fame, found himself, by his own admission, nearly broke. He launched a GoFundMe, explaining publicly that he had drained his savings on treatment and surgeries and currently had roughly $400 left in his bank account. He noted that Rick had helped cover some of the costs, but framed it as a loan he fully intended to repay because, as he put it, his father was not made of money and had never raised his sons to expect handouts. The situation quickly became public, complicated, and messy in the way that family finances always do when they intersect with public platforms. Rick pushed back through TMZ, stating that as far as he knew, he had paid all of Corey's medical bills well before the GoFundMe was ever launched, and that Corey was a grown man in his 40s who was responsible for how he handled his own finances. Corey responded. Tensions surfaced. And then, on March 11, 2026, Rick issued a statement asking that the matter be handled privately, saying that he and Corey would work things out by talking to each other and not the media, and asking the public to respect that Corey's recovery was the priority. It was, in its way, exactly the kind of response you would expect from a man who has spent his entire adult life negotiating difficult situations and who understands that the most important deals are not the ones conducted in front of cameras. And through all of this, running alongside the grief and the new marriage and the family tension and the public scrutiny, Rick Harrison has been doing something that has surprised people who assumed the Pawn Stars era was winding down. He has been building. In February 2025, he and Chumlee launched a podcast called Pawn Stars After Dark, an independent venture not affiliated with the History Channel, where they discuss behind-the-scenes stories from the shop, bring in cast members and guests, and talk about the kind of deals and moments that never made it to air. The podcast landed immediately. Fans who had spent 15 years wanting more of the authentic, unfiltered version of what happened inside that shop found exactly what they were looking for. And then, also in February 2025, came the news that Pawn Stars as a television series was no longer under contract with the History Channel and was on indefinite pause after more than 20 seasons. The show that had defined a decade of American cable television had reached a crossroads. But Rick Harrison, characteristically, did not slow down. Season 24 premiered on January 7, 2026, with 10 new episodes, suggesting that whatever pause had occurred was not permanent. The machinery of the empire was still turning. He has also been vocal in 2026 about something that has nothing to do with television and everything to do with the real business that started all of this. Silver. Rick Harrison has been sounding a public alarm about what he describes as a structural deficit in the global silver market, driven by the explosive demand from the tech industry, data centers, electric vehicles, solar panels, and the growing recognition that silver is the best conductor of electricity on the planet. He has said publicly that silver is selling out of his shop as fast as he can source it, that the mines cannot keep up, that this is not a bubble but a structural reality, and that people who understand value, the way he has always understood value, should be paying very close attention. It is the kind of clear-eyed, knowledge-based market read that has defined Rick Harrison's entire career. The man who taught himself economics behind a pawn counter in Las Vegas is now being quoted in financial publications about precious metals markets. And it tracks completely, because this is who he has always been. So here is where we are, in March of 2026. Rick Harrison is 60 years old. He is newly married to a woman he describes as breathtaking. He is carrying the grief of burying his son Adam 2 years ago and his mother Joan just 4 months ago. He is navigating a public dispute with Corey about money and medical bills and the complicated inheritance of having a famous father. He is building a podcast empire while the television show that made him famous exists in an uncertain space. He is warning anyone who will listen about silver markets. And he is standing behind the same counter on Las Vegas Boulevard where his father handed him a place to stand when the world had already decided he did not belong anywhere. The counter is still there. So is he. And that, more than any deal or any rating or any episode, is the story worth understanding. Because Rick Harrison did not become extraordinary because things went right for him. He became extraordinary because things went catastrophically, repeatedly, stubbornly wrong, and he refused every single time to let that be the end of the sentence. The boy with epilepsy who read history books in temporary homes became the man who could hold history in his hands and tell you exactly what it was worth. The dropout who was told the system had no place for him built something the system is still trying to fully explain. The father who was not always in the room is the man who is now, in the back half of his life, asking out loud whether the room was worth the empire, and sitting with the honest, uncomfortable weight of not being entirely sure of the answer. He once said, in one of the most unguarded moments he has ever allowed himself in public, that you cannot build what I built without losing things along the way. The question is whether what you built was worth what you lost. And I am still not entirely sure I know the answer. That sentence, from a man who has spent his entire career knowing the price of everything, is the most honest thing he has ever said. And it is the thing that makes Rick Harrison's story not just a fascinating piece of American television history, but something far more enduring. A portrait of what it actually means to fight for a life, to build something real from almost nothing, to survive the losses that fortune cannot prevent, and to keep standing behind the counter long after the cameras and the crowds and the magazine covers have decided what your story means. Because your story is never finished while you are still in it. Rick Harrison is still in it. And in 2026, in the middle of grief and new love and family conflict and silver markets and a television show that may or may not be what it once was, he is still, unmistakably, irreducibly, completely himself. The most valuable thing, as he has always known, is the one thing that can never be pawned. The story you are still writing. That one is always worth more than the asking price.